Reveal season is over, but the fun is just beginning. Tomorrow we finally get to dive into the expansion, play with all the shiny new toys. However, we also got patch notes today. And the patch notes let us know that there are a number of card changes coming tomorrow as well. So pretty big balance update. With that being said, there are so many changes that the developers in the patch notes did not include their normal summary or reasoning for why they changed a certain card. They normally do that, but this time they just are listing the changes. Though if you're hungry for that sort of thing, they did say that on, I believe, Saturday. They had posted it on Twitter. The developers are going to do a live stream and kind of walk through the process, but for now, instead of giving us the individual card summaries, they gave us these kind of 4 overarching bullet points for why they are making these changes. So I wanted to highlight them before we jump in. First, they mentioned targeting the top, specifically the Azir, Irelia archetype, Nasus, Thresh, Trundle, Lissandra, and they say Draven decks, but I suspect this is a combination of like discard aggro and Ezreal Draven. They also mention, second bullet point, considering what's next. So they basically said that there are certain decks that they currently know are strong or they consider strong, but might not be as popular as those 4. And as such, they didn't want to adjust those 4 and just have new top tier decks reign supreme. They wanted to try to even out the playing field a bit more. So there are some changes that I think fall into this tier where they're just trying to preemptively hit some powerful decks. Then they also say they are focusing on region identities so that the regions can have like really identified strengths and weaknesses. They mentioned specifically like Bilgewater and incidental damage or big bets with big rewards sort of thing. And then they also mention all regions can perform. And I think this, even though they don't say it here, is specifically about Ionia because they make some Ionia changes that really buff that region in an almost scary sort of way. So with that being said, let's just jump into the changes. Misfortune has been unnerfed. Level 2 used to have Overwhelm. They took it away and now it's back. I think this just has to do with the regions can perform because let's be honest, Bilgewater's been in a rough space ever since Twisted Fate and Fizz got nerfed as an archetype. And the other archetypes, Scouts hasn't been relevant for a bit. Keg Control hasn't been relevant for a while. Like outside of Deep, Bilgewater's been non-existent. So they just revert a nerf. Jarvan gets a buff. Used to be that your allied units had to survive 4 or more strikes from blockers for him to level. Now it is 3 or more. And I really like this. Prior to the Irelia Azir shenanigans, right? Back when Nasus, Thresh, and TLC were kind of the top, I was having a lot of personal success with Jarvan and Shen. And I felt like it was a bit of an underexplored or underutilized archetype anyway. And so I think with many of the changes that are coming, that's worth exploring again. I really like this change. Once you do level Jarvan up, he does a great job of helping you control the board consistently by continuing to make the cataclysms. So this is a pretty big deal in my opinion for Jarvan. Tryndamere is unnerfed. So if you are a newer player, you may not know this, but level 2 of Tryndamere for a long time had tough and then they took it away, but it's back now. And I think this just has a lot to do with the fact that the game has changed and evolved. And back then, there were very limited ways that you could deal with a level 2 Tryndamere. And that's not the case so much anymore. So back to being tough. Karma has been unnerfed. Used to cost 5, got nerfed to 6, back to 5. Now, I don't think, because the changes to Ezreal are still there, I don't think this means old school Karma Ezreal comes back where you're just dead 20-0, but I do think Karma Ezreal could be making a comeback. Piltover and Zahn is already getting a number of tools to begin with the new, what I call the new static shock, right? The discounted static shock, but also with the changes to Will of Ionia that we're going to see later. I think that Karma Ezreal could make a comeback potentially. It won't be as powerful as it used to be, but this is pretty relevant. I also wouldn't mind seeing like Karma Lux shenanigans and a few other things, but Karma is unnerfed. Irelia, on the other hand, is nerfed. What they did here is kind of hit her scaling, so she's harder to level up. Before it was 12 or more allies have attacked, it is now 14 or more. And it might not seem like a big deal because she's still making those flawless duets pretty effectively, but it is a big deal because her Blade Surge shenanigans have been a bit out of control, even more so since they fixed her bug and kind of pseudo buffed her. So this is, I think, a relevant nerf that slows her down likely by about 1 turn on average in terms of leveling her up. Riven gets a buff, and I love this change. So when Irelia and Malphite were released, I thought their wording was pretty cool as far as the round start or when summoned, if you have the attack token, do a thing. And I always felt like Riven needed that treatment. And that's basically what's happening here. So now it's whenever you get the attack token or when she's summoned if you have the attack token. So in other words, before you were punished if you played her on curve, like on round 3 if you had the attack token, and now you still get that initial reforge. Nothing else really changes, but I think that is just a very nice quality of life buff for Riven. Heimerdinger gets a +1/+1 at both levels. This is actually a huge buff, because going from 3 health to 4 health in Runeterra is a very big deal. One of the biggest issues with Heimerdinger, because he's a backline champion, but one of the biggest issues is you play him and he dies to fervor or he dies to get excited or whatever, you're gonna have a bad time. But now he can even survive like Grasp of the Undying. This is huge. I don't know if it'll be enough to make him relevant because he's still rather slow to develop, but it's enough of a buff that I want to experiment with him again. Again, if you have not played Runeterra for a long time, there was a time when Heimerdinger was a legitimate meta deck, and he was kind of terrifying. We've been away from that meta for a very long time, and this will not take us back to that, because part of the issue is also the way his turrets worked, but I think this is very relevant for Heimerdinger, and it makes me excited to play with him again. Hecarim gets a buff, and that's words I never thought I'd say again. Hecarim used to be a 4/6 at launch that summoned 3/2 Spectral Riders, and he got nerfed quite a bit, but now he's going to be a 5/6 at base, but still summon the 2/2 Spectral Riders. I like this overall. The 1 extra health gives him some more survivability. There's a lot more units with 5 attack than there used to be because of the reputation mechanic. So allowing Hecarim to survive against those, I think, is a big deal. But it also still means that with this stat line, he loses value trades into other common 6 drops. So Alpha Wild Claw, the 6 cost Cytheria, they'll still block Hecarim and survive. Now you still have to deal with the riders, but overall I think this is a fair trade-off so that you're not auto-dying to reputation units, but still there's some element of risk or danger with some of the 6 cost cards. Azir gets a nerf. Just like Irelia, I think they are slowing down the scaling here. So instead of summoning 10 units to level up Azir, it's now 13, which I suspect, again, will probably slow him down by about 1 turn on average in terms of leveling. But that's kind of a big deal because it was not uncommon to play him on 3 and he's leveled up on 4. So this is a pretty big change. Nasus gets a nerf. Level 1 Nasus no longer has Fearsome. I think this is a great nerf and a very fair nerf. The biggest issue with Nasus, I think, before, and Nasus Thresh is an archetype, is if you leveled up Thresh and you swing with a Nasus, even if Nasus is only a 7/7 or an 8/8, because he has Fearsome and because Thresh comboing with Nasus in particular also has that challenger option, you used to be able to just like pull away maybe their only Fearsome blocker, and now Nasus was guaranteed to connect. And if you hit a Nexus for like 8, and then next round you Atrocity for 8, that's like 16 damage across 2 turns with very little opportunities to stop it, depending on the deck you're playing. Not saying there's no way to stop it, I'm just saying some decks had a very hard time dealing with that. So taking away Fearsome on the level 1 version of Nasus, I think is nice because now you can chump block Nasus, but that's also a decision you have to make, because if you chump block Nasus, then you're also feeding him so that he gets bigger, right? Because he's slaying, but at least you're not taking that Nexus damage now. Level 2 and level 3 both still have Fearsome. They work with his aura, so I like that they kept it there. I just think that this is a very fair adjustment, and so I like it. Keeps the flavor intact, reduces the effectiveness. Sivir gets a buff. Now levels up when you've dealt 30 damage instead of 35. I think this is a very big deal for her, specifically for the Overwhelm archetype. Many of the Overwhelm players were already kind of subbing her in place of Sejuani for a copy or two. I think it's going to be much easier to hit 30 damage, both in Overwhelm and in Reputation style decks. And a leveled up Sivir is a pretty big deal because you want your entire squad when they are attacking to have spell shield. That is annoying as all get up. So I love this. I actually should stop and say I love this right now. This is actually the kind of buff where I could see myself later going, man, I hate this because everything has spell shield. Because this is, in my opinion, this is going to be pretty easy to hit. You think about how easy it is to like trigger Reputation right now, and 30 total damage is just like triggering Reputation +2. So I think it's good for Sivir. I think it's good for her playability, but there's a chance that I could eat my words later and be like, maybe I don't like that as much. Talia gets some help. I misread this when I first saw the patch notes and I thought she was nerfed and I felt bad, but it's not actually a nerf. What they've done is they've removed the landmark requirement for her ability to trigger 3 times. So before, you would attack, it would deal 2 to the blocker, and if it's dead or gone, you deal 2 to the enemy nexus instead. And then it would do it 2 more times if you had a landmark, which was in theory great, but in practice rough, because many of the landmarks that Talia was playing in her style of decks had countdown. And so if there wasn't one on the board and you attacked with her, even if you've leveled her up, it felt like a really lackluster payoff if she was only pinging 1 time. So her new text says, attack, deal 2 damage to my blocker 3 times. If it's dead or gone, deal 2 to the enemy nexus instead. So they've kind of, you know, made her more consistent, but also maybe not as explosive. But I think overall, this is just a really good quality of life change, and I'm happy for it. Next up, we have Taric, who gets buffed, gets 1 extra health at both levels. This is a pretty big deal because he's a support champion. And as a support, he's got to attack with your other attackers. That puts him in danger. So getting him up to 5 health is, I think, a big deal. It's going to help him to level up more consistently, makes him more attractive, along with another card update you'll see later. And I actually am back to wanting to experiment with Taric again. So this, I think, is good. Aphelios gets part of his nerfs reversed. So he is back to a 3/3 and a 4/4 when leveled up, but moon weapons still cost 3. Now, the fact that they still cost 3 means maybe Tri-Beam is cool. I used to love playing Aphelios with Lux. Now it's only 2 moon weapons to get a laser. So maybe that part of the nerf isn't too bad, but the big deal here is that he just doesn't die to Mystic Shot anymore, so that's great. Maybe we'll see more Aphelios again. When Aphelios launched, he was my favorite champion. Like, easily. So I'm excited to see him get some love. Moving on from champions. Make It Rain is unnerfed. It used to cost 2, and it was a staple in Bilgewater decks, and it kind of was nutty all over the place. And then it got nerfed to 3, and it kind of disappeared. But it's back to 2. And it really makes me want to experiment with like Ezreal Twisted Fate or Ezreal Bilgewater something. Because maybe kegs even, because now we have burst speed keg generation. But with Make It Rain back to 2, and that has potentially up to 3 enemy targets for Ezreal. And then you have Static Shock for 2 targets. And then you have the new time spell for 2 targets. There's just so many things you can do with that archetype. And so I'm excited to see this go back from 3 to 2 as somebody who's played a lot of keg control. And I'm looking forward to messing around with Make It Rain again and not feeling terrible about it. Black Market Merchant goes from a 2/1 to a 2/2. So trying to give some love back to Nab, but I don't think Nab will ever exist in the former glory that it did before. I think the big change here is that it doesn't die to incidental stuff. Like having a merchant on the board was nice because of the cost reduction. So when you draw an enemy card, reduce its cost by 1. So you would want to keep your merchants on the back line to keep getting that cost reduction, but they might accidentally die to like a Withering Wail. So in that regard, I like this change, but I don't think it makes this any more playable than it already was. It's just more satisfying. Double Up gets a buff, goes from a 6 cost card to a 5 cost card. I think this plays into that thing they were talking about with like region identities and Bilgewater and incidental damage. This is a risk reward. Now the risk is you have to kill an enemy with it, but the reward is you spent 5 mana to kill a unit and deal 4 to the Nexus. So when you compare that to like Decimate, for example, Decimate was going in a lot of burn decks for just 5 deal 4 at slow speed. This is potentially 5 deal 4 to the enemy Nexus and kill a potential blocker, but you have to actually kill it, right? So there's that risk reward part that they were talking about with Bilgewater and their region identity, but I like this. This actually makes me want to experiment with it in aggro decks as a potential Decimate replacement. Slotbot gets a buff. It used to be just on round start, it would get the buff and then scramble its stats. Now it's on summon and round start, it gets the buff and scrambles its stats. So Twisted Fate, Casino, Slotbot decks getting a little bit of love. Confront gets a buff from 3 to 2. I like this change. Demacia has already been leaning pretty heavy into the kind of challenger region, which makes sense. They're a very combat centric region to begin with, but with the new card that supports your units that have challenger, and with the kind of newer cards, not new this expansion, but from previous ones that wanted you to be challenging things, making this go from 3 to 2 makes it far more, I think, cost effective and affordable. And even still, like, you look at this and then you look at like field promotion and you're like, well, maybe I'd rather still have field promotion, but don't scoff at like tossing something challenger permanently. That's kind of a big deal. If anything, it makes me want to play with Garen some more, because with him having regen and he wants to be striking things anyway, and once he's leveled up, you're rallying every round. You can like really, if you can protect your Garen, you can really control the opposing board with a Garen that has challenger permanently. So I think that this is good enough to make me at least experiment. I don't know if it's going to make it good, like on a competitive level, but again, just one of those nice quality of life buffs that makes me want to experiment. Mage, Seeker, Insider gets 1 extra health. I think this falls into that like Heimerdinger area where you were paying an expensive card that was like dying to get excited. And so before, you never wanted to play this on curve, which was sometimes awkward. And so you would play it and then it would die before you ever get to play your 6 cost or more spell. So going to a base of a 4/4, I think is good. It's still not very exciting. Even when it pops off, you're paying 4 for a vanilla 6/6. You know, yay. But this is a nice quality of life change. Blade Keeper, on the other hand, this is a buff I can get behind. So it goes from a 2/3 to a 3/3. But that means you're now paying 4 for a total of a 5/5 in stats. But more importantly, having 3 attack means this now blocks fearsome units. Having 3 attack means it trades better into 3 and 4 cost units, where before most of your, like a 3 cost 3/3 was still value trading into your Blade Keeper. So yeah, you gave something else +2/+2, but who cares? This means you get a lot more mileage out of it. I know it doesn't seem like a big deal, but there's a pretty big deal between 2 attack and 3 attack in this game. So I like this change a lot. Even if this ends up never cracking a competitive deck, this is a really big quality of life change that I like. Howling Abyss gets a buff from 7 to 6 cost. I don't think it'll end up seeing a ton of competitive play, but if you know me, you know I love the card. So this is exciting for me on a personal level. Ren Shadowblade gets a 1 attack power buff, goes from a 3/3 to a 4/3. I think that this is a card they envision working in aggressive Ionia decks, because the strike also creates Shadow Fiends. So increasing its attack power increases its aggressiveness. I say envision because I still don't think this is good enough to make this like feel satisfying and see play, but I'm glad that they're trying to support it. Dancing Droplet. This gets nerfed by losing a tune, and I think this is a very fair nerf because this card did way too much, if I'm being honest. It was a 1 cost 1/1 with a relevant keyword and elusive that kind of replaced its cost by attuning, and then also had a nice passive effect where you would draw extra cards when you recalled. So like you compare that to the Bilgewater 1-drop with a tune, which is just a 1 cost 2/1 with a tune, and you're like, okay, well, I sacrifice 1 attack power, but I gain elusive and I draw cards. Kind of a no-brainer, right? So I think in terms of trying to separate some of the region identities a little bit more and responsibilities, and maybe also promoting Irelia being played in other archetypes by leaving the attune on the Bilgewater side, maybe now you run Irelia and Misfortune and you consider the 2/1 with a attune. Do I think that's likely? Probably not. But I think that this was the right thing to attack here because it also reduces crazy like retreat return starts and lead follower shenanigans. Like, I think this is fair. Green Glade Lookout gets a buff. Goes from a 2/1 to a 2/2. I've always felt like this card was actually pretty neat, and there's a lot of support for Ionia late game based decks, whether it's Karma or other things, and this was, I think, meant to be their way to ramp into the late game. So I like the flavor. The fact that this died to like Vile Feast or again like incidental Withering Whales or whatever, I always felt bad. I don't know that this is going to be good enough for it to still see play, but I like that they're trying to give this some more love. Young Witch gets a buff. As somebody who's played a lot of what I call elusives, I love this. No longer dies to Vile Feast. It's not going to even be worried about like Dancing Droplet or Teemo blocks or whatever. This is a pretty big deal. Might not seem like a big deal, but I think this is a pretty big deal, and I love this. Makes me a bit scary though that elusives could be making a comeback. I hope they don't get more support. Oh wait, my bad. Will of Ionia is getting its nerf reversed. It's going from a 5 cost back to a 4 cost. Now if you are a newer Runeterra player and you do not remember how things were at launch, this card was a staple in Ionia. It was a 3 of in basically all your Ionia lists. It terrorized mid-range decks because of, you know, you play your fatty that costs 6 and this bounced it for 4 and you kept your tempo. This was a big deal. And so there's a lot of people on my Twitter feed, for example, who have been like, I don't know why they're unnerfing Will. And I think personally, so remember there was those 4 bullet points. I think it has a lot to do with this 4th one. All regions can perform. Because let's be honest, Ionia hasn't been in a great spot for a long time. And I think this is a great way to maybe, you know, give you a reason to play Ionia. But holy cow, this gives you a reason to play Ionia. So look out for this. You're going to be running into it. I mean, you could meme and say like, oh yeah, Yasuo support. But really, this is like all Ionia decks. And again, like I'll run this in elusives. I'll run it in a bunch of things because it's just very tempo appropriate. It's a pretty big deal. I'm both excited and nervous for this change. I'm kind of on the fence about it, but it's a pretty big deal. Twin Disciplines gets a buff from 3 cost to 2 cost. I think this is actually great for the card and also fair when you compare this to the 2 elixirs that cost 1. You know, one of them providing 3 attack, the other 2 health. Here you're basically paying 1 extra mana for the versatility of kind of choosing between the 2. So I think it's more fair now, but I used to run this a lot, or at least a fairly decent amount, even when it costed 3 back when Ionia used to be a region. But now that we're getting Will of Ionia back and we're getting some other buffs, it's back to being a region. And so I suspect I'll be sneaking in at least a 1 or a 2 of my Twin Disciplines tech again, because it really is nice to have this versatility. It's either burst damage for trades, burst damage to go for lethal, or the +0/+3 to counter stuff like Get Excited or targeted removal is a pretty big deal. So I like this change. Now I will also say, specifically Will of Ionia and Twin Disciplines here. This one might not make the cut, but I'm a bit scared because I haven't seen a lot of adjustments that really hinder Lee Sin. And so Lee Sin could be on the comeback gang. Incisive Tactician. This gets a buff from a 4/5 to a 5/5. If I had to guess, this is just a thematic buff because this is a reputation card that costs 8 and it didn't even count towards your own reputation count if it hit. So making this at least count towards reputation, I think is fine. I don't think it increases its playability anymore, but I like that they're still at least making it fit thematically. City Breaker goes from a 0/5 to a 1/5, and I actually really like this for Swain decks and Sejuani decks and Plunder decks and you name it. That one attack matters, and we've seen it in the past with something like Braum, but granted Braum also has Challenger and was making Poros, and I'm not saying City Breaker is Braum, but we've seen the power of going from 0 attack to 1 attack in the past. And I think this is potentially another one of those cards. Being able to block and not take damage versus being able to block and then still kill things that only have 1 health is a pretty big difference. And I mean, that's all I can really say on that. I don't know that it's going to make a big splash in the metagame because unfortunately, you know, spoiler alert before we hop down, Equinox didn't get nerfed, so your Leviathans still get kind of wrecked by Targon. And that kind of hurts Swain decks in my opinion. Sejuani, you still have to have enough ways to get that damage in early before City Breaker starts to be that like guaranteed Sejuani trigger. So I don't know, but I like it. I think that this is a fair buff to make City Breaker at least considered in certain decks. Jay gets a buff, goes from a 4/4 to a 5/5. And this, in my opinion, mostly just helps his survivability, but also as somebody who loves playing Taric with Jay, because then you draw a bajillion cards. The fact that Taric got a buff in survivability and Jay got a buff in survivability means that my meme dreams are coming back. I don't know that that's going to be a deck even close to competitively viable, but it's a really fun time as far as memes go. So I like this. Speaking of memes, Henchmen goes from 3 health to 4 health. Again, to me, this falls into that same category of you didn't want to pay 5 for something and have it die to Get Excited or whatever that did 3 damage. So I like this. I don't know that this is still going to be good enough to see play, because like the dream is you play this card, you give a map to it so it's elusive, it hits the enemy nexus, and now you have 2 elusives. Next round, if they both hit, now you have 4. But that's a really slow payoff, and it doesn't have like any other keywords on its own. So like you either have to give it Overwhelm yourself, or you have to give it Elusive yourself, whatever. So like I like this card, and it's fun, and it can be pretty good in something like Expeditions. I'm happy to see the buff, but I don't think that this is going to make like a metagame splash. Rummage finally gets a nerf. Rummage has been the best draw spell in the game, in my opinion, since the game launched, because the drawback in Piltover and Zon was very rarely a drawback, and we were only getting more and more ways to subvert it over time. So being able to pay 1 to draw 2 and also activate your discard effects and end up with like a Jury Rig and a Flame Chompers was always really good in discard aggro. But then in decks where you were supposed to have more of a hindrance, so think like mid-range or control decks for Piltover and Zon, we started getting things like Ballistic Bot so we could pitch the Ignitions, and we were getting things like Stress Testing for the combo decks. And over time, Rummage was just, in my opinion, a pretty glaring offender that was going to be adjusted at some point, and that time is finally now. I think this is still playable at 2, so... Tri-Beam Improbulator goes from 4 to 5 cost. This is a pretty healthy nerf, but I think the decks that wanted to run it probably still run it, because the reality is, in most cases, you were playing this for like 4 damage or more anyway. And so paying 5 mana, like let's just say you get it to 4, paying 5 mana to deal 4 damage to a unit and then also summon a random 4 cost unit is still pretty good. If we're being honest with ourselves, even paying 5 mana to do that for 3, like I know it's slow speed, but if you spend 5 mana, deal 3 to something and get a free 3 drop, like you're coming out ahead on value. It does not take long to get a tri-beam there. So I think this is fine. I mean, the card has been pretty good and Azrael and Draven for quite some time. So this also might have been a bit of a preemptive nerf because with us now getting that new 3-cost Elnuck, it's entirely possible that there's other abusers of this that were creeping up. Watcher gets adjusted. So it now costs 0 if you've summoned 5 allies that cost 8 or more. 5 or more allies that cost 8 or more. Used to be 4. But also the Obliterate effect got adjusted. So it's a Maokai kind of clone, or it's closer to Maokai now. So now on attack, you obliterate all but 3 non-champion cards. I like this because it gives opposing control decks the opportunity to respond. You've got a little bit better of a window. And if I'm being honest, it just makes Maokai relevant again. Like Maokai used to be your go-to mill strategy, and it's a champion that requires you to build around it to do it. And then the Watcher was just like, you know, hold my cosmic horror, let me just obliterate the whole thing. So I think this is fair. Rasa gets a buff. Yay! Rasa is one of my favorite cards from the original set, but unfortunately it's +1/+1 in stats. Boo. So Rasa used to cost 7 and it was nerfed to then costing 8. I'm gonna tell you right now that anytime I've ever thought about Rasa and potential buffs, it was never like, oh, I wish Rasa was bigger. I'll put it that way. I want Rasa to go back to costing 7. Probably too busted at 7 because it was in a lot of decks back then. But I miss Rasa. I miss Rasa. That's it. Dusk Rider gets a small buff, goes from 2 attack to 3 attack. I like that the base stats go up because it means that this fearsome unit can now block other fearsome units, but this was very rarely being run in main deck Nightfall lists anyway. This was most often created by cards like Unspeakable Horror, and in the future it might be created by the new, you know, Leona Diana themed card generator. So it's going to be mostly relevant there. It might be relevant in something like Expeditions as well, but this isn't going to like suddenly make this a big splash in the metagame. It's just a nice quality of life buff, really. Escaped Abomination does not escape nerfs again. So it is nerfed once again to a 4/2. There was a time, gang, when this was a 4/4. And then it got nerfed to a 4/3, and now it's a 4/2. And it will still see play. Just so we're clear. It's not as powerful anymore, but it will still see play. Stalking Shadows gets nerfed. I've seen a lot of people saying that they are sad to see this, but I'm kind of surprised it took as long as it did. A 2-cost burst spell that basically draws you 2 cards and you get to make a choice selection of the ones you're getting is pretty powerful. And I think that the fact it was played in so many decks across so many archetypes showcases exactly how powerful that was, because yes, this nerf hurts Nightfall, where it was very powerfully adapted, but Stalking Shadows was also played in Sumpworkers decks, and Stalking Shadows was played in like Teemo, Prankster, Burn decks, and basically any deck where you could spam Doom Beasts. But it was also played in stuff like Matron Cytheria, where you can go find your combo pieces and abuse those as well. It was played in a lot of places, and I think that's just a power level thing. So, you know, again, going from a 2-cost draw to a 3-cost puts it more in line with many of the others, and so I'm not surprised that we're seeing this. The Clock Hand gets a buff. It's from a 4/7 to a 7/7, which it needed because that 4/7 body was really not great for an 8-cost card. I don't know that this makes it suddenly more relevant. I don't know that it's going to be played more as a result, if you will. The decks that were running this were running it more for the effect. So this is, I think, just a quality of life buff to make you not hate having spent 8 mana for a 4/7 body. Raz Bloodmain gets a buff from a 6/6 to a 7/7. This is a card that I always think about because I like it. I like its design. It's a great top end fearsome card to kind of give you a closer, because when it attacks, it's probably making all your fearsomes unblockable at that point. I just don't know that it's good enough to start seeing play again, because kind of like with Rasa earlier, I never looked at Raz and said, like, the reason I'm not playing Raz is because it's not big enough. It's the cost, right? I think you want Raz to be played sooner, before your opponent finds a way to blow up your whole board, as opposed to later. But that's just my train of thought. Dunekeeper gets what is basically a nerf. It goes from a 2/1 to a 1/2. All the decks that ran Dunekeeper before, let's be honest, they're still running Dunekeeper. You're just not dealing as much damage on round 1. Mountain Sojourners gets a big buff from a 2/5 to a 4/5. Everything else stays the same. This is a card that in the right deck is an insane mountain of stats, but now it can also block fearsome units, and now you're spending 5 mana to be more threatening when you attack, and it makes it much more difficult to block this effectively without losing units on the opposing side. That used to be the drawback to this, was like, if this chained through your supports, it gave a lot of permanent stats with the grant effect, but you might have lost this in a trade, right? Because it's a 5-cost card with only 5 health, so you're probably going to lose it to a 5/5 or something. Now, even at a 4/5, it doesn't trade into 5/5s, but it's making those trades a lot less safe. So, huge fan of this. And again, with the changes to Taric already, I kind of want to, explore and experiment with that archetype again. I think this is a very nice buff for this card. Sun Guardian is unnerfed. Used to be a 4/4, was nerfed to a 4/3. It's back to a 4/4. It's been a long time since Daybreak Targan, like, mid-range was relevant, though, and I don't think this suddenly puts it over the top. But I don't hate the buff again, or the nerf reversion, or however you want to word it. Like, it's fine. Star Shaping gets a nerf. It's now healing 4 instead of 5, and everything else is the same, which means it's still more cost effective than Decimate. Like before, I used to always laugh because, your opponent would spend 5 at slow speed to deal 4 to you, and then you'd spend 5 at burst speed to heal more than they did to you and invoke for a huge Celestial. Now you break even, but you still end up with the invoke. So Star Shaping, probably still playable. The Serpent catches a nerf. Goes from a 2/1 to a 1/1. Still a 0 cost, so it helps in that regard. 0 cost cards that help you with your count for Zoe are always great, and 0 cost cards in general allow you to do a number of things. It still has Challenger, so it can pull away potential blockers that would have been giving your opponent value trades, but now the Serpent itself doesn't trade as well, and so that's the trade-off here. The Fangs. This is a pretty big nerf. This is actually a pretty big nerf. So, goes from a 3/2 to a 2/2. And I've been saying a lot for the buffs that were, units going from 2 attack to being bigger, that it's relevant because of fearsome. Same thing applies here. Fangs can no longer block fearsome units. That's a big deal. And you're not gaining nearly as much health with the lifesteal. You do still have the invoke, but it's a much more difficult decision now when you're deck building, because you have to decide, do I care more about the invoke or do I care more about the lifesteal? And if it's the lifesteal, you're probably going to go with the Solari instead at that 4 slot. So this is a pretty big nerf to Fangs, gang. And that's the end of it. So region road updates, we get some more of those. Labs updates, we're getting new heroes added. Love it. And they're changing the prologue to be more new player friendly, which I also love. The more people we can get onboarded into the game, the better our game will be. So I adore everything going on here. Personalization, we get some champion skins. Now, no alternate level up animations, but we do get Sandstorm Echo and Sandstorm, Sand Wraith Pike. So we get some champion skins. New board. This is Sunken Shipyard, but it's basically Pike themed, and I adore it. I love the like gold on the side as well. Card back for Pike, card back for Rek'Sai, some new emotes as well, and some bundles. And that's it, really. Well, expedition changes and bug fixes, but that's it for the patch notes. So a lot of changes. I think it's really hard with this many changes and the infusion of new cards to make true predictions about the meta. So I was kind of trying to address the more individual or more situational things to highlight for each card change, because for the next week, maybe even 2, it's going to be a bit of a wild west on the ladder, in a good way though. So feel free to experiment, try the new stuff, try your old favorite decks that might be back because they have reverted some nerfs, whatever. But this is the patch notes. If you made it this far, I appreciate you. Thank you for sticking with me. I know this was a long one, but I'm not going to keep you any longer. So I love you. Until next time, may you walk on warm sands, and let's all have a great time with the new expansion tomorrow.